The basement smelled like wet cardboard and motor oil, and that's what I remember thinking about as I lay on the concrete floor with blood pooling under my head. Not the pain. Not my son's footsteps walking away upstairs. Not even his wife's voice saying plain as Sunday, "Just leave him. Maybe he'll learn something this time." I remember the smell. My name is Walter Hennessy. I'm 69 years old, and 3 months ago my own boy tried to kill me in the house I built with my hands in 1978. The house where his mother died, the house where I taught him how to ride a bike on the driveway out front. He pushed me down 14 wooden steps and walked away with his wife to finish their lasagna upstairs. What he didn't know is that I made one phone call before I passed out. And what neither of them ever understood, not in 40 years of him being my son, is who his father actually is. Let me back up. I retired 6 years ago from a job I never talked much about at the dinner table. Folks in our little town outside Wheeling, West Virginia knew me as Walt the Contractor. I built decks, finished basements, fixed roofs after the bad storms in 03 and 11. That's what I did the last 22 years of my working life. Honest work, quiet work, the kind where you go home tired and your wife rubs Bengay on your shoulders and complains you smell like sawdust. But before that, I had another life. I was Army CID for 19 years, Criminal Investigation Division, the kind of military police that investigates the military itself. I worked fraud cases mostly, embezzlement, forged contracts, officers stealing from their own units. I put a one-star general away in 1989 for siphoning fuel money out of a base in Germany. I worked alongside the FBI on 3 different joint task forces. I knew federal prosecutors by their first names, and some of them still send me Christmas cards. My son Daniel never asked about any of that. To him, his old man was just a guy who came home in a uniform when he was little, and then a guy who came home covered in drywall dust when he was older. He never wanted to know the in-between part, and I never pushed it on him. His mother always said he was sensitive, didn't like hearing about bad things, and I let her shape him the way she wanted. She passed in 2021, pancreatic cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to gone. Daniel cried at the funeral, and his wife Megan held his hand, and I thought, all right, at least he has somebody. At least my boy isn't alone. That was my first mistake, thinking he had somebody. The truth is Megan had him. She was always one of those women who smiled with her teeth, but not her eyes. 42 years old, blonde out of a bottle, manicured every 2 weeks, drove a Lexus they couldn't afford. She worked part-time at a real estate office in Pittsburgh, which is where they lived for most of their marriage, about an hour and a half from me. They had no kids. Megan said her body wasn't built for it. Daniel said, "Okay, Megan, whatever you want." After my wife died, I lived alone for almost 2 years. Did fine. The house was paid off in 1999. I had my Social Security, a decent military pension, and savings I'd been quietly stacking up for 40 years because I grew up poor and never trusted banks completely. I had my routines. Coffee at 6 a.m., the local diner with the old fellas on Tuesdays, church on Sundays, even though I only half believed it anymore. I was all right. Then in March of last year, Daniel called me crying. He'd lost his job. Some kind of restructuring at the marketing firm he worked at. Severance was thin. Megan was barely making anything part-time. They had a mortgage on a house in the Pittsburgh suburbs that, it turned out, they couldn't actually afford. He said, "Dad, we just need a place to land for a few months. Just till we get on our feet." I said yes before he finished asking. Of course I said yes. He was my boy. His mother would have haunted me from the grave if I'd said no. They moved in 2 weeks later. 3 haul trips. Megan brought a leather sectional that didn't fit in the living room and made me move my recliner into the corner. She brought a treadmill that went into what used to be my workshop. She brought a Peloton bike, which she called Essential, and which she rode maybe 4 times in the first month, before it became a coat rack. Daniel was quieter than I remembered. He'd lost weight. There was something hollow in his eyes that I chalked up to losing the job. I figured a couple weeks of his old man's cooking and some honest air would put him right. For about 3 weeks, things were almost nice. Megan was on her best behavior. She cooked twice. She asked about my late wife, and I told stories, and she made the right faces. Daniel and I went fishing one Saturday at Tomlinson Run. He didn't catch anything, but he laughed when I did. And for a moment I thought, my God, I have my son back. Then the second month started, and I felt the temperature drop. It started with little things. Megan didn't like that I made coffee at 6 a.m. The grinder was loud. Could I make it the night before and just reheat it? I said the night before and just reheat it. I said the night before makes it taste like dirt. She made a face. Daniel said, Dad, just maybe wait till 7. I waited till 7. Then it was the TV. I watched the news in the evenings. Megan said it was depressing and bad for her anxiety. Could I watch it in my bedroom? My TV in the bedroom was a 14-year-old box. Fine. I watched it in the bedroom was a 14-year-old box. Fine. I watched it in the bedroom. Then it was my friends. Tom and Eddie fellas, I'd known 30 years, used to come by Saturday mornings to drink coffee and complain about the government. Megan said it made her uncomfortable having strangers in the house. I said they aren't strangers. They're my friends. This is my house. She said, well, it's our house too now, isn't it? Daniel said, Dad, please. I told Tom and Eddie we'd meet at the diner from now on. Each thing on its own was nothing. A cup of coffee, a TV channel, a friend on a Saturday. But each thing was a piece of me, and she was peeling them off one at a time like she was prepping a chicken. By month 4, I'd been moved out of the master bedroom. Daniel said it gently, said Megan was having trouble sleeping, said the master had the better window unit, said it was just temporary. They'd take the master, I'd take the guest room. I was 69. The guest room had a single twin bed. I said okay, because by that point I was tired of the small fights and figured the big one wasn't worth picking over a mattress. Then in October, Megan brought up the basement. She said the guest room was right next to theirs, and Daniel snored and she snored and the walls were thin, and would I mind just for a little while sleeping downstairs? She'd already set it up. There was an old couch down there and she'd brought down a space heater and she'd put a lamp on the workbench. Just for a little while, she said, until they figured out their next steps. The basement of a house I'd built with my own 2 hands. In 1978, I lay on that couch the first night and I thought about my wife. I thought about how if she could see me, she'd be so angry. Not at Daniel. At me. For letting it happen. For being too tired to fight back. I almost called my brother that night. Almost called my old buddy from CID, Frank Devlin, who is now retired and living down in Charlotte. Almost called the diner crew. But I didn't. Because I thought, this is my son. He's going through something. I'll give him a little more rope. He'll figure it out. That was my second mistake. The third mistake was not paying attention to the mail. About 2 weeks after I moved into the basement, I noticed Daniel was getting a lot of envelopes. Big ones, from banks I didn't recognize. I asked him about it once, and he said it was just paperwork from the unemployment office. I let it go because I wanted to let it go, but I started watching. That's the thing nobody understood about me. The contractor part wasn't all of who I was. I'd spent 2 decades watching liars lie to my face for a living. I knew how to wait. I knew how to seem stupid and slow while my brain cataloged every detail. I started noticing Megan was on the phone a lot, hushed, in the backyard, smoking, which she'd told Daniel she'd quit. I noticed Daniel had stopped applying for jobs even though he claimed he was still looking. I noticed there was a brand new Tag Heuer watch on his wrist one Tuesday. I noticed Megan came home with shopping bags from stores I knew cost real money. Nordstrom, a jewelry place out of Pittsburgh. I noticed and I didn't say anything. I just watched. In late November, I came upstairs early one morning to use the kitchen. They didn't hear me. Megan was at the table with a stack of papers in front of her, and Daniel was standing behind her, and she was saying something about his signature, and before the end of the year. When she saw me, she shoved the papers under a magazine like a teenager hiding a cigarette. "Morning, Walt," she said with her teeth showing. I made my coffee. I went back downstairs, and I waited. 3 nights later, when they were both out at some restaurant, I went upstairs and I went through her purse. I went through Daniel's laptop bag. I went through the home office where she'd taken over my old desk. I found enough to make my hands shake. There was a power of attorney form with my name typed on it. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine. It wasn't. It was a decent forgery. Whoever did it had practiced. but I'd looked at thousands of forged documents in my career, and the W in Walter was wrong. I made a sharp angle on the second stroke. This W was rounded. There were emails on Daniel's laptop in a folder called Dad that included correspondence with a real estate firm about listing the property, my property, with a target list price of $340,000. There was a loan application in my name for $150,000 against the equity of the house, submitted to a lender out of Cleveland, almost approved, and there was a printed out spreadsheet in Megan's handwriting with a number at the bottom, $487,500, which was, I figured out later, what they expected to net once they sold the house, cashed out the loan, and accessed an account they somehow already gotten partial access to. They were going to clean me out, and then I realized they were going to put me somewhere. There was a brochure in Megan's purse, a memory care facility in Steubenville, Ohio, the cheap kind, the kind where the residents sit in front of a TV in a common room, and nobody changes the channel for 6 hours. Megan had circled the price. I sat in the dark of my own kitchen at midnight, staring at a brochure for the place where my own son was going to put me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt ready. Now, here's where I want to slow down, because I know what people listening are going to ask. They're going to say, Walt, why didn't you call the police right then? Why didn't you change the locks? Why didn't you throw them out? And the answer is, I needed more. I'd been a CID investigator for 19 years. I knew how these cases went. If I called the cops right then, what did I have? A power of attorney that I claimed wasn't my signature. Emails that Daniel could say he hadn't actually sent yet. A loan that hadn't actually closed. A brochure in a purse. The DA might charge it, might not. Even if they did, my son, the boy I raised, would look at me from across the courtroom and his lawyer would say his father was confused, was forgetful, was angry about losing his wife. They would build a case that I was the problem, and it would work, or half work, and Daniel would walk away with a slap, and Megan would smile her teeth at me, and they'd be gone, and I'd be old, and I'd be alone, and I'd have nothing. I needed them to do something undeniable. So I waited. I started keeping a notebook. Every morning I wrote down what I'd heard, what I'd seen. Every conversation Megan had on the back porch that I could overhear from the basement window. Every piece of mail I intercepted. Every receipt I fished out of the trash. I called Frank Devlin and Charlotte and told him everything. Frank was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, Walt, you need to get the hell out of that house. I said, Frank, I can't. If I leave, I lose. They'll have free run of the place and the documents. He said, then at least let me come up. I said, not yet. Wait until I call. But be ready. Frank said, Walt, you're 69. I said, I know how old I am. Frank said, your boy might do something stupid. I said, I know my boy. What I didn't say to Frank, what I barely admitted to myself, was that I wanted him to. I wanted Daniel to do the stupid thing, because the stupid thing was the only thing that would let me put him away forever. It was December 18th. I'd been keeping the notebook for 3 weeks. I had photos of the forged power of attorney on a burner phone I'd bought at a Walgreens in town. I had downloads of the email folder from Daniel's laptop, which I'd done on a Saturday when he'd left it open and gone out for cigarettes with Megan. I had recordings, audio recordings, of Megan in the backyard talking on the phone about the old man's situation and moving him by January. What I didn't have was them physically harming me. I figured I'd never get that. I figured the worst thing that would happen was them legally trying to push me out, and I had enough to stop that and reverse it. So I was about ready to make my move. I was going to call Frank, have him drive up, and walk into the local sheriff's office with a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Then it was December 19th. That morning, I came upstairs to get coffee and I overheard them in the kitchen. Megan was angry. She was saying the loan had been delayed, the underwriter wanted additional verification from the homeowner, and that they needed me to come into a notary to sign some things. Daniel said I'd never agree. Megan said, then make me agree. I walked into the kitchen. I said, good morning. Megan went pale and then pink. Daniel stared at his cereal. I said, I was thinking I'd go check on the water heater downstairs. It's been making noise. Daniel looked up. He said, I'll come with you. I said, I'll come with you. I said, no need. I built it. I know it. He stood up. He said, I want to. We went downstairs together. He was behind me on the stairs. About halfway down, where the wood gets a little soft and creaks under your weight, I heard him exhale. Then I felt his hand on my back. Not a guiding hand, a pushing hand. It happened fast, and it happened slow at the same time, the way bad things do. I felt my body leave the step, and I felt my hip hit the railing, and I felt the wood of the railing crack, and then I was falling, and the basement floor was rushing up at me, and I hit it shoulder first, and then my head hit the corner of the workbench, and then there was nothing for a second. Just smell, wet cardboard, motor oil, my own blood. I heard Daniel come down the stairs. He stood over me. I had my eyes mostly closed. Mostly. I could see the toes of his boots. He said, Dad? His voice was flat. I didn't move. He said, Oh God, Megan, get down here. She came down. She didn't run. She walked. I want you to remember that. My son's wife walked down the stairs to where her father-in-law was bleeding on the concrete floor. She stood next to him. They looked at me. Megan said, Is he breathing? Daniel said, Is he breathing? Daniel said, I don't know. She said, Well, check. He didn't check. He just stood there. Then she said, real quiet, real even, like she was talking about a piece of meat she'd left out too long, Just leave him. Maybe he'll learn something this time. Daniel said, What if he... She said, Daniel, he fell. He's old. He fell down the stairs. That happens to old men. We were upstairs eating dinner. We didn't even know. There was a pause. Then I heard Daniel exhale again. That same exhale he'd done on the stairs. He said, Okay. They went back up. They turned off the basement light. They closed the door at the top of the stairs. I want to be clear, because I've thought about this part every night for 3 months. My son did not push his father down the stairs in a fit of rage. He did not lose his temper. He did not have a moment of weakness. He had 2 hours to think about it that morning. He came downstairs with the intent to do it, and when it didn't kill me, he walked back up the stairs and ate lasagna with his wife and let me bleed out in the dark. That is who my son became. Now here's what they didn't know. I had a phone in my back pocket. Not the burner, my regular phone. And in my regular phone, I had Frank Devlin on speed dial, and I had 3 numbers below his that they could not have imagined I had. My right arm was working. Not great, but working. I rolled slowly onto my hip, and I worked the phone out of my pocket. My vision was swimming. I knew I had a concussion, and I knew I was bleeding from somewhere above my eye. I figured I had maybe 10 minutes before I lost consciousness. I called Frank first. He picked up on the second ring. I said, Frank, they did it. He said, Walt, where are you? I said, basement. He pushed me. I'm bleeding bad. I need an ambulance, and I need the sheriff, and I need you to call Marcus. Marcus Riley was a U.S. attorney out of the Northern District of West Virginia. I'd worked with him on 2 cases before he was a U.S. attorney, when he was just an AUSA cutting his teeth. He owed me one. He owed me more than one. Frank said, on it. Stay on the line. I said, Frank, one more thing. Tell Marcus I have everything documented. Tell him this is wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery, attempted murder, and elder abuse. Tell him I've got the file. Tell him I want it federal. Frank said, Walt, stay awake. I said, I'm trying. I heard him on his other phone, his voice sharp the way I remembered from 20 years ago, calling 911 in West Virginia from his living room in Charlotte. I heard him say my address. I heard him say elderly male, head trauma, possible homicide attempt by family member, perpetrator still in residence. The last thing I remember before I passed out was Frank saying, Hold on, Walt. Hold on, the cavalry's coming. I woke up in Wheeling Hospital 30 hours later. Frank was in the chair next to my bed. He looked older than I remembered. He saw my eyes open, and he stood up, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, You stubborn old son of a bitch, we got them. The sheriff's deputies had arrived 18 minutes after Frank's call. Daniel and Megan, when the deputies knocked on the door, told him everything was fine, that there'd been no incident. The deputies asked if there was anyone else in the house. Daniel said no. The deputies asked again. Daniel said his father was upstairs sleeping. The deputies asked to do a wellness check. Megan said, "No, you don't have a warrant." The senior deputy, a woman named Sergeant Holloway, who I later wrote a thank you letter to, that she framed and put on her wall, said, "Ma'am, we have a 911 call from a former federal investigator placing the homeowner in this basement, bleeding from a head wound, and we are going to check that basement now, and you're going to step aside." They found me on the floor in a pool of blood, unconscious, phone still in my hand. The call to Frank still active and recording. They arrested Daniel and Megan on the front porch. The recording, by the way, captured everything. My fall. Their conversation over my body. Megan's exact words. Daniel agreeing to leave me there. All of it. While I was in the hospital, Marcus Riley's office moved fast. I'd given Frank instructions on where the file was. There was a fireproof box in the basement behind a panel I'd cut into the wall in 1985 that I'd been adding to for 2 months. Photos of the forged power of attorney, the downloaded emails, the audio recordings of Megan in the backyard, the bank application, the brochure for the memory care facility with Megan's fingerprints all over it, my handwritten notebook. The U.S. Attorney's Office indicted Daniel and Megan on 12 federal charges between them: wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy. The state of West Virginia added attempted murder, criminal neglect of an elder, and aggravated assault. The trial was 4 months later. I sat in the front row. I testified for 3 hours. Daniel didn't look at me once. Megan looked at me the whole time. Her teeth weren't showing anymore. The recording from my phone was the moment that ended it. The jury heard her say, "Just leave him. Maybe he'll learn something this time." 12 people in that jury box. I watched their faces while it played. One woman put her hand over her mouth. A man in the back row shook his head and didn't stop shaking it. Daniel got 22 years federal, with state time to run consecutively. Megan got 18 federal, plus 6 state. They'll be in their 60s when they come out, if they come out. The marriage didn't survive the first month of incarceration. She filed for divorce from a county jail in March. I got my house back. Every penny they'd touched got returned, with interest and damages, by court order. The fraudulent loan was unwound. The forged documents were nullified. My name was cleared on every line they'd tried to write it on falsely. I sold the house anyway. Couldn't sleep there anymore. The basement was the basement. I bought a small place on a piece of land outside Morgantown, with a workshop in the back and no stairs to anywhere. Tom and Eddie come over Saturdays again. I make coffee at 6 in the morning, loud as I want. Frank moved up from Charlotte for the summer. He's staying in my guest room. He says he might just stay, period. His wife passed last year and he says Charlotte doesn't feel right anymore. I told him, there's no rush either way. People ask me sometimes if I forgive my son. I don't have a clean answer for that. I think about him every day. I think about the boy who rode his bike down the driveway. I think about the man who put his hand on my back on the basement stairs. They are, somehow, the same person. I cannot reconcile it. I don't try anymore. But I'll tell you what I learned, and what I want any other old man listening to hear. When you raise a child, you give them everything, and somewhere along the way you decide you're going to trust them with everything too. You decide they're the safest place in the world for what's left of you. And for most folks, most of the time, that's true, but not always. And the day you start noticing the signs, the little ones, the cup of coffee, and the friend turned away, and the bedroom you got moved out of, that is the day to start writing things down, quietly, carefully, without telling anybody. Because the people who love you don't make you smaller, they make you bigger. And anybody who is shrinking you is doing it for a reason. I waited too long to act in some ways. But in another way, I waited exactly long enough. I waited until I had what I needed, and when the moment came, my hand found my phone, and the phone found Frank, and Frank found Marcus, and Marcus found the law, and the law found my son. One call, from the bottom of a basement I built with my own hands 46 years ago. That's all it took. And to anyone out there who thinks the old man in the basement is alone and slow and finished, you don't know who he used to be. You never bothered to ask. I've had 3 months now to sit on my back porch outside Morgantown and turn this whole thing over in my head, and I keep coming back to the same hard truth. Nothing that happened to me in that basement was random. Every piece of it was something somebody chose, link by link, all the way down the chain. Daniel didn't push me on a whim. He pushed me because Megan asked him to, and Megan asked him to, because she'd convinced him over months that I was a problem to be managed instead of a father to be loved. And she was only able to convince him of that because somewhere along the way, my boy had stopped being able to tell the difference between what was easy and what was right. He chose easy every time for years, until easy turned into something I can't put a kinder word on than evil. That's cause and effect. That's the law of it. You make small, selfish choices for long enough, and one day you find yourself standing over your own father with his blood on the concrete, agreeing with your wife to walk back upstairs. But the same law worked the other way for me. Every quiet morning I spend watching instead of yelling. Every notebook entry, every photo I took of a forged document while my hands shook, every phone call to Frank and Charlotte where I refused to act before I was ready. None of that was luck. That was a man choosing to be patient when his heart was screaming at him to be loud. That was the harder road, and the harder road was the only road that worked. If there's anything I want a person listening to take out of my story, it's this. Your character is built in the small hours when nobody's watching. Daniel built his character lying to himself about job applications he wasn't sending and watches he couldn't afford. I built mine sitting on a cold concrete floor at 69 years old, writing down dates in a notebook I'd hidden behind a furnace. Be decent. That's the moral part. Don't let anybody, not your spouse, not your friends, not your own greed, talk you out of treating people the way they deserve to be treated, especially the ones who raised you. Be sharp. That's the wisdom part. Pay attention to the small things. The cup of coffee you got asked to make differently. The friend who got turned away at the door. The bedroom you got moved out of. Those are not nothing. Those are the first sentences of a story somebody else is writing about your life, and if you don't pick up a pen, they'll finish it without you. And be tough. That's the part nobody talks about anymore. Old age is not the end of you. The world will tell you it is. Megan tried to tell me it was. My son tried to tell me it was with his hand on my back. They were wrong. I am still here. I make my coffee at 6. The house I lost was just wood and nails. The man inside it, the one they thought was finished, he was the strongest part of that whole property all along.